Good day everyone. I'm going to report about one of the current issues and concerns in the field of genetics, which is vascular development in the fetal human heart. The human heart is the first functional organ to develop. It begins beating and pumping blood around day 21 or 22, a mere 3 weeks after fertilization. This emphasized the critical nature of the heart in distributing blood through the vessels and the vital exchange of nutrients, oxygen, and waste both to and from the developing baby. This protein is essential for the heart to develop properly at an early stage, and that is called NCX1, and it plays a key role in the generation of the calcium signals needed to produce the beating action of the heart. The embryological development of heart structures. The heart forms from an embryonic tissue called mesoderm, and it is one of the 3 primary germ layers that differentiates early in development that collectively gives rise to all subsequent tissues and organs, and it forms around 18 to 19 days after fertilization. And the heart begins to develop near the head of the embryo in a region known as the cardiogenic area. It is an area begins to form 2 strands called the cardiogenic cords. As the cardiogenic cords develop, a lumen rapidly develops within them. At this point, they are referred to as endocardial tubes. The 2 tubes migrate together and fuse to form a single primitive heart tube. And the primitive heart tube quickly forms 5 distinct regions. From head to tail, these include the truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, primitive ventricle, primitive atrium, and the sinus venosus. Truncus arteriosus will eventually divide and give rise to the ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. Bulbus cordis develops into the right ventricle. The primitive ventricle forms the left ventricle. The primitive atrium becomes the anterior portions of both the right and left atria and the 2 uricles. The sinus venosus develops into the posterior portion of the right atrium and the SA node and the coronary sinus. As the primitive heart tube elongates, it begins to fold within the pericardium, eventually forming an S shape, which places the chambers and major vessels into an alignment similar to the adult heart. This process occurs between days 23 and 28. The remainder of the heart development pattern includes development of septa and valves and remodeling of the actual chambers. Partitioning of the atria and ventricles by the intratracheal septum, interventricular septum, and atrioventricular septum is complete by the end of the 5th week, although the fetal blood shunts remain until birth or shortly after. And the atrioventricular valves form between weeks 5 and 8, and the semilunar valves form between weeks 5 and 9. And by the 3rd month of fetal development, the heart and all major blood vessels are basically formed, and the blood flow is generally the same direction as the adult. However, there are some major differences between fetal and postnatal circulation. First, oxygenated blood flows toward the fetus and into the heart in umbilical veins, and deoxygenated blood flows away from the fetus in umbilical arteries. Second, the fetus obtains oxygen from the uterus through the placenta, and the fetal lungs are essentially non-functional. Therefore, fetal circulation has a number of features to direct most of the blood away from the lungs. The first is an oval hole in the endotracheal septum. This hole is called the foramen ovale. The foramen ovale is not really a hole but rather a valve covered by 2 flaps that prevent the regurgitation of blood. It is a passage for blood to flow from the right atrium into the left. A second feature of the fetal heart is the ligament of the inferior vena cava. This ligament is located inferior to the opening of the vena cava and extends medially to the atrial septum, passing inferior to the foramen ovale. It is much more prominent in the fetus than in the adult and functions in the fetal circulation to direct in a laminar flow the blood coming into the right ventricle toward the foramen ovale to pass into the left atrium. The third feature of fetal circulation is a way for oxygenated blood that has been pumped from the right atrium to the right ventricle to be diverted from the pulmonary circulation into the system circulation. And despite the shunt from the right atrium to the left, much of the oxygenated blood that enters the right atrium gets pumped into the right ventricle. The ductus arteriosus is a connection between the left pulmonary artery and the aortic artery so that the very little blood reaches the immature lungs. Because the pulmonary vascular resistance of the fetus is large, only 1/10 of right ventricular output passes through the lungs, and the remainder passes from the pulmonary artery through the ductus arteriosus to the aorta. In the fetus, the diameter of the ductus arteriosus can be as large as that of the aorta. Shortly after birth, the umbilical cord is cut and the newborn takes a first breath. Rising concentration of the hormone prostaglandin are believed to result in the closure of the ductus arteriosus, and the lungs receive much more blood. The increase in pressure is translated to the left atrium. This pressure pushes together the two valve flaps of the foramen ovale, closing them and preventing the flow of blood from the right to the left atrium. How does the fetal circulatory system work? During pregnancy, the unborn baby depends on its mother for nourishment and oxygen. Since the fetus doesn't breathe air, his or her blood circulates differently than it does after birth. The placenta is the organ that develops and implants in the mother womb during pregnancy. The unborn baby is connected to the placenta by the umbilical cord. All the necessary nutrition, oxygen, and life support from the mother's blood goes through the placenta and to the baby through blood vessels in the umbilical cord. Waste products and carbon dioxide from the baby are sent back through the umbilical cord, blood vessels, and placenta to the mother's circulation to be eliminated. While the baby is still in the uterus, his or her lungs are not being used. The baby's liver is not fully developed. Circulating blood bypasses the lungs and liver by flowing in different pathways and through special openings called shunts. The blood flow in the unborn baby follows this pathway. Oxygen and nutrients from the mother's blood are transferred across the placenta to the fetus through the umbilical cord. This enriched blood flows through the umbilical vein toward the baby's liver. There it moves through a shunt called the ductus venosus. This allows some of the blood to go to the liver, but most of this highly oxygenated blood flows to a large vessel called the inferior vena cava and then into the right atrium of the heart. And here is what happens inside the fetal heart. When oxygenated blood from the mother enters the right side of the heart, it flows into the upper chamber, and most of the blood flows across to the left atrium through a shunt called the foramen ovale. From the left atrium, blood moves down into the lower chamber of the heart, and it's been pumped into the first part of the large artery coming from the heart. From the aorta, the oxygen-rich blood is sent to the brain and to the heart muscle itself. Blood is also sent to the lower body. Blood returning to the heart from the fetal body contains carbon dioxide and waste products as it enters the right atrium. It flows down into the right ventricle, where it normally would be sent to the lungs to be oxygenated. Instead, it bypasses the lungs and flows through the ductus arteriosus into the descending aorta, which connects to the umbilical arteries. From there, blood flows back into the placenta. There, the carbon dioxide and waste products are released into the mother's circulatory system. Oxygen and nutrients from the mother's blood are transferred across the placenta. Then, the cycle starts again. At birth, major changes take place. The umbilical cord is clamped and the baby no longer receives oxygen and nutrients from the mother. With the first breath of air, the lungs start to expand and the ductus arteriosus and the foramen ovale both close, and the baby's circulation and blood flow through the heart now function like an adult. The unique about the fetal heart is that the fetus does not use its own lungs until birth, so its circulatory system is different from that of a newborn baby. Before birth, the fetal heart does not have to pump blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. In other words, the fetal heart does not need a separate pulmonary artery and aorta.